What is a currency war? Well, it is a type of economic warfare. Instead of using planes, tanks, and guns to damage another country, you use financial instruments instead. In the past few years, you may have heard of trade wars, when one country decides to tax goods from a foreign country in order to either protect a domestic industry or to encourage a foreign country to get rid of their own tariffs. Well, currency wars are similar to that, except instead of manipulating tax rates, you're manipulating monetary policy and interest rates.
Currencies from different countries are out in the global economy, and they all have value in relation to each other. Some currencies like the US dollar, the euro, or the pound are worth more than pesos or yen. Having a weaker currency can encourage foreigners to buy stuff from your country for relatively cheap. A currency war is when multiple countries are trying to devalue their currencies in order to gain a trade advantage over each other. This phenomena is rather new because the technological means for it did not exist prior to the early 20th century, when the first currency war was fought. Currency War I was triggered by the monetary policies of the First World War. Prior to the war, the global economy operated on an international gold standard.
I recommend pausing this video, opening another tab, and then watching this video if you want to fully understand it. But here's the short version.
In the international gold standard, all the participating countries publicly declare their currency to be worth a certain amount of gold. This allows paper money from any country on the gold standard to be exchanged for gold in any other country also on the gold standard. When one country's gold supply goes too low, their banks would raise their interest rates, while banks in countries with higher gold supplies would lower theirs. This would result in gold moving from banks with low interest rates to banks with higher interest rates.
This mechanism kept the international gold supply in equilibrium, and so long as the rules are followed, it continues to function properly. However, wars don't just result in the rules of politics and civility falling away, they also result in the rules of economics being ignored.
World War I was expensive, and supplies of gold would have run out quickly had they kept to a gold standard. So most of the countries involved in the war abandoned the gold standard in order to prevent all of their gold flowing out of their banks. Both the Entente and the Central Powers used fiat money, printing more as needed to fund the war effort. This radically increased the supply of paper money floating around in their economies. But luckily the velocity of money was also high, meaning that there were always places for that money to go. But when the war was over, the demand for military goods was gone, and thus this excess money suddenly had nowhere to go. Thus inflation occurred. All the European powers saw this happen, but Germany would see the worst of it. The Treaty of Versailles placed burdensome reparations on Germany, which were required to be paid in gold marks. This resulted in whatever gold Germany had left being gradually given to France, Britain, and the United States. But there wasn't enough gold left to operate a domestic economy as well, so Germany didn't restore the gold standard after the war. The government still needed money to operate, so in 1921 the Reichsbank began to buy government bonds, paying for them in newly printed Deutschmarks. This money was used to pay government workers, which eventually made its way into the private sector, thus causing inflation.
For people who were in debt, this was beneficial, considering that they could pay off their old debt, which was nominated in Deutschmarks, with the new Deutschmark that wasn't backed by gold rather than the old one that was. Business owners and banks could initially survive as well, considering that they both held on to a lot of non-liquid assets, and the value of these non-liquid assets went up as the Deutschmarks were devalued. The wealthy were also initially safe because they could get their money out of German banks and into foreign ones, and on top of this, people who worked for the government or worked in trade unions were also pretty safe because their salaries by law went up commensurate with inflation. Which meant that the people who were screwed the most were either those who didn't own property or those who were employed in the private sector.
In 1922, inflation turned into hyperinflation. The Reichsbank continued to print more and more money to meet the demands of government and union workers. But the more they did so, the worse the problem got. You have the infamous stories of people needing a wheelbarrow full of money to buy a loaf of bread. Customers offered to pay for meals at restaurants in advance because the price of the meal would go up between having ordered their meal and when they finished eating.
By the end, they were printing so much money that they were only printing on one side of the currency in order to save ink.
In 1922, the international community tried to re-establish an international gold standard at the Genoa Conference. Unlike the original gold standard, which involved every currency being backed by its own supply of gold, the new standard allowed banks to substitute gold with another gold-backed currency. Since the United States was one of the only countries involved in the war to not go off the gold standard, its currency was the favored one to substitute gold in most bank reserves. This new gold standard didn't quite have the desired effect, because gold continued to accumulate in countries with strong currencies like the United States, while weaker countries continued to face gold shortages. Out of fear that Germany's monetary policy was going to cripple their ability to pay their reparations in the future, France occupied the Ruhr Valley in western Germany in order to secure payments. The Germans didn't like this, so Union workers in the Ruhr responded with slowdowns, strikes, and sabotage. The Reichsbank approved of these actions and rewarded the unions by printing them additional money for wages and benefits, which subsequently made the hyperinflation worse. On November 8, 1923, the National Socialist Party, led by Adolf Hitler, attempted a coup in Bavaria called the Beer Hall Putsch. The coup was squashed, but this was a sign that things had gotten really bad. So on November 15th, the Reichsbank introduced a second currency that would circulate alongside the old mark, called the Rentenmark, which was backed by mortgages and property taxes. One Rentenmark was valued at 1 trillion old Deutschmarks. The next year, the Reichsbank introduced a new gold-backed mark, leaving the old marks literally worthless. These years of economic chaos in Germany created high levels of distrust in public institutions. The bankers had wrecked the economy, and it was the wealthy who benefited the most. All the while, foreign powers were either invading their country or trying to foster revolution.
Things did start to get better in 1924. Not only was there the issuance of the new gold-backed Deutschmark, but also the United States introduced the Dawes Plan, which reduced the amount the Germans had to pay in reparations, as well as opened up lines of credit from US banks to Germany in order for them to continue paying the reparations they still had to. It also introduced the introduction of a new gold standard from the Genoa Conference. However, this new gold standard would be short-lived. You want to know what else is short-lived? This promotion for the Casual Historian Teespring store. Show your appreciation for our smallest educational YouTuber by purchasing a t-shirt, hoodie, or mug. To celebrate the official launch of the merch store, you can use the discount code LAUNCH at checkout to get 10% off your purchase. More designs will be added in the future, but this discount code only lasts till the end of October, so go ahead and check it out. It's a great way to support the channel. But for now, back to the history.
In 1925, the Gold Standard Act was passed in the UK, which returned the pound sterling to gold. When countries were debating whether to return to the gold standard, a sub-question was at what rate? Should they return to the same pound-to-gold ratio they had before the war, or readjust the value to meet the demands of where the economy was now? When France and Germany returned to the gold standard, they chose the latter, choosing to devalue their currency against their current supply of gold. But in 1925, the UK government, at the insistence of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Winston Churchill, decided to return pound sterling to its pre-war value. This required the UK government to pull millions of pounds out of circulation, which caused deflation. This put the UK into a deep recession and weakened its economic growth, especially in comparison to France and Germany. Winston Churchill later said that this was one of the biggest mistakes of his political career. The new exchange rate would begin to fall apart in 1927. Both France and the US had high levels of gold reserves, while the UK had low reserves. Under the rules of the International Gold Standard, France and the US should have lowered their interest rates and the UK should have raised their own in order to encourage the movement of gold. But the UK was refusing to increase their own interest rates because doing so during a recession would be politically unpopular. But on top of this, the British accused France of intentionally undervaluing their own currency in order to maintain a trade advantage.
The United States was the only one of the big three gold countries that was still following the rules of the International Gold Exchange, and unfortunately they would be breaking it themselves soon enough.
In 1928, the Federal Reserve began increasing its own interest rate out of concern that the stock market had been inflated too much. Stock prices in the US went up because more and more money was being funneled into it, and this was done because there weren't any foreign assets worth investing in because France, Britain, and the rest of Europe refused to follow the rules of the gold standard by increasing their own interest rates. Also, in 1928, Germany went into a recession, which was made worse by the stock market crash of 1929. Bad was stacked on top of worse when the US passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff in 1930, which overlaid a trade war on top of a currency war. Things continued to get worse in 1931, when the Credit Anstalt Bank of Vienna announced its losses, which wiped out its capital assets. This triggered bank runs around the continent and resulted in bank holidays being declared in Austria, Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. Gold quickly began to flow out of British banks, which forced them to abandon the gold standard on September 21st. This was shortly followed by Commonwealth countries as well as Japan and Scandinavia also abandoning the gold standard. The worsening economy resulted in incumbent US President Herbert Hoover losing the 1932 election to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the most economically illiterate and financially incompetent president to ever hold the office.
His first major act was declaring a bank holiday, which he did with the Trading with the Enemies Act, which had been passed in 1917. It was one of the few pieces of economic legislation passed during the Wilson administration that the Republicans didn't later repeal. You can learn more about that in this video. The banking holiday did restore confidence in the banking system, but behind the scenes not much was actually done. Most of the banks that were on the precipice of insolvency still were, but the banking holiday at least made it look like something was being done, and so investor confidence was restored a bit.
Prior to Roosevelt, the US had never done any strategic devaluing of its currency in order to boost trade. Every time it did so was in accordance with the rules of the gold standard. But FDR still wanted to increase exports. So first they repealed the Smoot-Hawley tariff, but that wouldn't be enough. Most of Europe was off the gold standard and were enticing exports with devalued currencies. FDR wanted the benefits of devaluing the currency without rewarding the people who held gold. You see, FDR blamed the Depression on gold owners hoarding their money. If he tried to devalue the US dollar, this would increase the price of gold, benefiting those whom he blamed for the problem. FDR's plan was for the federal government to nationalize as much gold in the US as possible. This started with Executive Order 6102, which confiscated all gold held in private hands, which were to be exchanged for paper money. This was followed by Executive Order 6111, which banned the exportation of gold without approval from the US Treasury. The last big executive order on gold was Order 6261, which forced all gold mines in the US to sell their gold to the US Treasury at a price the Treasury determined. This order functionally nationalized the gold mining industry.
The purpose was to take the gold out of the hands of private gold holders and replace it with paper money. This way, the government could feel free to devalue it without increasing the value of gold and thereby rewarding the gold hoarders. That way also, the gold hoarders would be encouraged to spend their money rather than just holding on to it. FDR once decided that the value of gold should be $21 an ounce. And the reason for this is because 21 is 3 sevens and 7 is a lucky number. I'm serious, this is not a fake story. This comes from his Treasury Secretary. FDR was really that dumb. It is incomprehensible how dumb he was. I'll have a video dedicated to that at some point in the future, but for now, let's continue on.
The capstone of FDR's gold policies was the Gold Reserve Act of 1934, which set the new price of gold at $35 an ounce, and voided all gold clauses in private contracts. It also created the US Treasury's Exchange Stabilization Fund, commonly referred to as a slush fund, which doesn't require congressional appropriation to spend. The currency war, which functionally began in 1921 with the hyperinflation crisis in Weimar Germany, would be ended in 1936 with the tripartite agreement. France, the UK, and the US agreed to stabilize their currencies and not retaliate against each other. On the surface, this seemed fine and dandy, but the agreement left loopholes that allowed each country to devalue their currency if they needed to promote domestic economic growth. With that provision, this agreement was functionally worthless, because they were allowed to abandon the terms if domestic concerns outweighed the international ones, and they always would. This agreement was followed shortly by World War II in 1939, and a new real gold standard would be set after the Bretton Woods Conference, but that's another story for later.
I want to give a quick thank you to my patrons, and I also want to thank you guys for watching this video. If you want to learn more about economics, I have a playlist right here that you can check out, or you can check out the latest video over here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.